So in this video, we are going to talk about earned value management, EVM. EVM is a technique to help us measure the project progress in an objective manner. Usually when we want to manage the performance of the project, we want to see whether we are over or under the budget, or whether we are ahead or behind the schedule. And EVM can help us do that. There are a couple terms that you need to understand when you are trying to use EVM. The first one is the budget cost of work schedule, BCWS. That's the total value or the total cost based on your scheduled project. For example, if you say that I'm going to spend 60% of my budget at day 7, and that would be your budget cost of work scheduled. The second term is the budget cost of work performed, BCWP. This is the actual progress you made up to the certain point. And you need to remember that the budget cost of work schedule and the budget cost of work performed may not be the same. Sometimes it will be ahead of the schedule. If that's the case, the BCWP will be higher than the BCWS. However, if you are behind the schedule, the work performed will be lower than the work schedule. The actual cost will be the actual monetary value you spend on the project. That can be different from the BCWP and the BCWS as well. And usually, if we want to measure the progress, we can compare the BCWP and the BCWS. And usually, we want to use the SPI or the performance index to measure whether we are ahead of the schedule or behind of the schedule. So SPI is calculated based on BCWP divided by the BCWS. So if the SPI is greater than 1, it means that our project is ahead of the schedule. However, if SPI is less than 1, it means that the project is behind the schedule. Then we also want to measure the cost. We don't want to overspend, and we also want to make sure that with the actual money we spend will be less than our budget. Ideally, they can be identical. So we can calculate something called CPI, Cost Performance Index. This is based on BCWP divided by AC. When the CPI is less than 1, it means that the costs are higher than planned, so you are overspending. However, when the CPI is greater than 1, it means that the costs are lower than the plan. So you are doing a pretty good job containing the cost. So let's take a look at example without using EVM. If you don't try to use EVM, in many cases, people will try to compare the BCWS and the AC. But if you try to compare these two values, it doesn't tell you whether you are actually ahead of the schedule or whether you are behind of the schedule. It also doesn't tell you whether you are overspending or underspending. And that doesn't really help you much. However, if we have EVM, we can actually track our progress. So if the actual work performed is higher than your work scheduled, then we know we are doing a pretty good job. We are ahead of the schedule. However, like here, if the actual work performed is less than the work scheduled, then we are behind. So this is a typical example where using EVM can be very useful. And we can also use EVM to check the actual cost. If we want to do that, we want to compare the actual work done and the actual cost. So in this case, the actual cost is lower than the BCWP, so we are under the budget. However, if AC is higher than BCWP, we are over the budget. So let's try to use an example to see how we can do the calculations. In this example, we have 4 activities. Activity A, B, C, and D. Suppose we are right here at X. We want to do the calculation to check whether we are over the budget, under the budget, or whether we are ahead of the schedule or behind the schedule. So a couple of things that you can check here. For example, at time X, I know that I should finish all activity A already. So activity A is 100% scheduled and 100% complete because the entire region is red. And for activity B, but when we reach time X, we should be able to complete the entire activity B already, but our actual progress is only 80%, okay? And for activity C, we should be able to complete 80% of the project when at time X, but we actually only complete 70% of the project. Similarly, for activity D, we should be able to complete 50% of the project activity D already, but in reality, we haven't started to work on activity D yet. So how can we do the calculations? The first thing we want to calculate is the BCWS, the budget cost of work schedule. Suppose activity A's cost is 18K, activity B will be 10K, C will be 20K, D will be 40K. The first thing we want to do is to calculate how much work should be done based on your schedule at time X. As we mentioned earlier, activity A should be 100%, activity B should be 100% as well, activity C will be 80%, activity D will be 15%. So we calculate 100% of 18K for activity A, 100% of 10K for activity B, 80% for activity C, and 50% for activity D. We sum up all the costs together, that will be 50K. That will be our BCWS. Then we want to calculate what will be the budget cost of work performed. So this one we want to base on the actual progress. So we know A is 100% done, B is 80%, C is 70%, D is 0%. So we find out the percentage for those activities, multiply by their actual cost, and find out the sum. That will be our BCWP. Then we can calculate the Schedule Performance Index, SPI. And we know SPI will be BCWP divided by BCWS. So 40K divided by 50K, that will be 0.8. So remember, when this value is less than 1, we know we are behind of the schedule. Okay? We can also calculate the CPI, and in order to calculate CPI, we want to use BCWP divided by AC. Usually AC will be given in the problem descriptions. In this case, it will be 45K. So we have a CPI equal to 0.9, which means we are spending more than we should, because based on your schedule, you should be spending 40K only, but you are already spending 45K, so you are spending more than you should. So you are behind of the schedule, and you are spending more than you should. You are not doing a good job to keep this project on the track. So let's try to work on this example together. And we want to calculate SPI and CPI. We know the expected progress. We also know the actual progress. We also know the budget cost for each of those activities. So in order to calculate BCWS, we want to use the budget cost multiplied by the expected progress. So I have 15K for B, 80% for B, 20K for C, and 80% for C. That should be equal to 36K. Okay? Then we want to calculate BCWP, the budget cost works performed. And that will be based on the actual cost and the budget cost. Okay? 10K multiplied by 85%. 15K multiplied by 70%. 20K 90%. In this case, the answer will be 37K. Then we can calculate SPI. Remember, the formulation for SPI is BCWP divided by BCWS. So I have 37 divided by 36. This is roughly equal to 1.028. And when the value is greater than 1, we know we are ahead of the schedule. Okay, although not much, but we are still ahead. Okay, how about the CPI? In order to calculate CPI, it will be BCWP divided by AC. AC is given right here. So the answer will be 37 divided by 32, roughly equal to 1.156, which is greater than 1. When you have the CPI greater than 1, it means that you are under the budget. So in this case, we are ahead of the schedule. We are also under the budget, which means we are doing a pretty good job to keep this project on track.